Margaret Chin stood before the gleaming glass tower of Silverton Development Corporation on a gray November morning in Chicago, 2018. The wind whipped off Lake Michigan, cutting through her threadbare pea coat. In her arms, she clutched a worn canvas messenger bag, its strap repaired multiple times with duct tape and twine. At-73, Margaret moved with careful deliberation, each step measured but purposeful. Her hair, now silver white, was pulled back in a simple bun. The reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck were held together with a small piece of wire. Inside the soaring atrium, morning light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating marble imported from Italy and a reception desk carved from a single piece of walnut. Young professionals in tailored suits hurried past, their expensive shoes clicking against the polished stone. Margaret approached the security desk. The guard, a man in his 30s with a crew cut, looked up from his phone and immediately frowned. "Ma'am, can I help you?" His tone suggested he doubted she belonged there. "I'm here to see Harrison Silverton," Margaret said quietly but clearly. "I have business regarding this company." The guard exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one. This company was built with my designs." A woman waiting nearby in a Chanel suit turned to stare. A young intern paused, phone already in hand. Word rippled through the atrium like a stone thrown into still water. The second guard stepped forward, hand moving to his radio. "Ma'am, you're going to need to leave." "I'm not leaving until I speak with someone about ownership records," Margaret said, her voice remaining steady. "I have documentation." By now, a small crowd had formed. Someone laughed a sharp, dismissive sound. Another person whispered to their companion, and both smirked. Harrison Silverton III emerged from the executive elevator, his face already flushed with irritation. At 48, he carried himself with the confidence of inherited wealth. Expensive watch, custom suit, hair styled with product that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the atrium. The guard gestured toward Margaret. "This woman claims she has some connection to the company, sir." Harrison's eyes swept over Margaret, her patched coat, her worn bag, her simple clothing, and his lip curled. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but this is a place of business. Security, please escort her out." "Mr. Silverton," Margaret said, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching, "your grandfather and I founded this company together in 1968. I designed the first 3 buildings that made your fortune. My name was on the original incorporation papers." The lobby went completely silent, then someone laughed. Another joined in. Soon a wave of mocking laughter filled the space. Harrison's smile was cruel. "You expect anyone to believe that? An elderly woman in a thrift store coat claiming she founded Silverton Development?" He turned to the crowd, playing to them. "This is what happens when mental health services fail our seniors." Margaret reached into her bag, but the security guards moved fast, grabbing her arms. The bag fell, and its contents spilled across the marble floor. Instead of trash or random papers, dozens of architectural blueprints unfurled across the pristine stone. Yellowed drafting paper covered in precise technical drawings, bearing official stamps and signatures. Engineering calculations in faded pencil. Photographs of construction sites from decades past. The laughter faltered. A young architect from the firm's design department stepped forward, kneeling to examine one of the blueprints. "These are original hand-drafted plans," she said, her voice uncertain. "You can't fake this kind of aging." "The paper, the ink, this is from the 1960s. "Those are forgeries," Harrison snapped, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Probably bought them at some estate sale." Margaret remained calm as the guards held her arms. "The Riverside Plaza building. Your first major project, completed in 1970. The structural innovation that made it possible was my design, a cantilevered steel frame system that no one else was using at the time. Patent number 3,487,612, filed under my name and your grandfather's jointly." An older man in the crowd, perhaps a retired engineer, pulled out his phone and began searching. His eyebrows rose. "The patent exists. Joint filing. Margaret Chen and Robert Silverton." Harrison's face darkened. "Get her out of here. Now." The guards dragged Margaret toward the doors, her worn shoes scraping against the marble. She didn't struggle, but her dignity remained intact, back straight, eyes forward. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly as they pushed her toward the exit. "I have more than blueprints. I have proof your grandfather tried to erase." "The only mistake," Harrison called after her, loud enough for everyone to hear, "was letting you waste our time." They shoved her through the doors into the cold November air. Margaret stumbled but caught herself. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking up at the glass tower that her designs had helped create. Then she turned and walked away, her canvas bag clutched tightly, As phones captured her departure and the morning's humiliation spread across social media within minutes, across town, in a small cafe near the University of Chicago campus, Margaret sat at a corner table nursing a cup of tea. The place was warm and shabby, frequented by students and professors rather than the polished professionals from Silverton's world. Her phone, an old flip model she'd had for years, buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Miss Chen? A young woman's voice, nervous but determined. My name is Sophie Reeves. I'm a junior architect at Silverton Development. I was in the lobby this morning. Margaret said nothing, waiting. I saw your blueprints. I've studied architectural history. Those drawings, they're real, aren't they? Why are you calling me, Ms. Reeves? A pause. Because what happened this morning was wrong. Because I went back to the archives this afternoon and started pulling old records, and there are gaps. Missing files. Projects from the late 60s and early 70s that don't have complete attribution. And because. Sophie's voice wavered. Because I got into architecture because I believed it should be about integrity. What I saw today wasn't integrity. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering another young person, decades ago, who had believed in integrity. Before the world taught them otherwise. Meeting me could cost you your career. I know. But some things matter more than a job at a corrupt firm. Margaret gave her the cafe's address. 30 minutes later, Sophie Reeves walked through the door, a black woman in her late 20s, dressed in professional attire but with an earnestness in her eyes that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. They found a booth in the back. Sophie placed a folder on the table between them. I brought copies of what I could find without raising suspicion. Project files from 1968 to 1974. The early years of the firm. She opened the folder. Look at the attribution. On projects from before 1971, there are two sets of initials on the final sign-offs, RS and MC. After 1971, only RS appears. Margaret studied the documents, memories flooding back. The Riverside Plaza. The Morrison Medical Center. The Lakefront Cultural Complex. All her designs, her innovations, her sleepless nights solving impossible engineering challenges. What happened in 1971? Sophie asked softly. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was distant, seeing the past. Robert Silverton and I met at MIT in 1965. I was one of 3 women in the architecture program, the only Asian woman. He was from old Chicago money but genuinely talented. We became friends, then partners. We shared a vision, buildings that served communities, not just investors. She touched one of the old blueprints. We founded the company in 1968, right after graduation. Equal partners. My technical expertise and his family connections. It worked beautifully at first. We won competitions, secured contracts, pushed boundaries. What changed? By 1971, we'd become successful enough to attract attention from the major development firms. Robert's father was pushing him to go public, to scale up. But the investors, they didn't like the optics of a woman partner. Especially not an Asian woman. They threatened to pull funding. Margaret's jaw tightened. Robert started suggesting I take a less visible role. For the good of the company, he said. Temporary, he promised. But temporary became permanent. My name disappeared from presentations. Then from contracts. Then from the incorporation papers themselves, through a series of legal maneuvers I only partly understood at the time. He stole your company. He used the prejudices of the era to make it seem reasonable. Professional. Everyone around us accepted it because in 1971, who would believe a young Chinese-American woman over a well-connected white man from a respected family? Sophie's hands clenched on the table. You fought back? I tried. I had documentation, but not enough. The lawyers Robert hired were better than mine. The courts weren't sympathetic. I was told I should be grateful for my contributions and move on. Margaret smiled bitterly. So I did. I moved on to other projects, smaller firms, freelance work. I built a quiet career. And I saved everything. Every blueprint, every contract, every photograph. Waiting. For what? For the right moment. For the right person to help me. Margaret looked at Sophie directly. For someone with access to what I can't reach anymore. Sophie leaned forward. What do you need? The original safe in Robert's office. It's still there. Harrison uses the same office his grandfather did. There's a deposit box system built into the floor, installed when the building was constructed. Robert thought I didn't know about it, but I designed that office. I know every hidden space. What's in it? The original partnership agreement. The real one, before the lawyers rewrote it. Proof that everything that came after was fraud. They talked for 2 more hours, forming a plan. When Sophie finally left, Margaret sat alone in the cafe, staring at her reflection in the darkening window. The woman looking back was old now, but her eyes held the same fierce determination they'd had 50 years ago. In a mahogany-paneled boardroom on Silverton Development's top floor, Harrison Silverton paced like a caged animal. Around the conference table sat his inner circle, corporate lawyers, a crisis management consultant, and his cousin Blake, the company's CFO. "We have a problem," Harrison said flatly. "That woman who came in today. Her name is Margaret Chin, and she's not just some confused old lady." He threw a folder onto the table. Inside were printouts of patent filings, archived newspaper articles, old business registry documents. She actually was involved with the company in the early days. My grandfather's first partner, before the partnership ended. One of the lawyers, Victoria Strand, picked up the documents. "How much exposure do we have?" "Hard to say. The original split was handled by lawyers who are long dead. The files from that era are incomplete." "Incomplete or destroyed?" Blake asked pointedly. Harrison didn't answer directly. "We need to control this narrative before it controls us. She's already gone viral," old woman claims, building empire. Social media is eating it up. The crisis consultant, a sharp-featured man named Derek Chen, tapped his tablet. "We've got mixed reactions so far. Some mockery, but also some sympathy, especially in architecture and engineering communities. Several influential bloggers are asking questions about women in mid-century architecture. This could become a larger story about historical discrimination. Then we discredit her before that happens," Harrison said firmly. "I want everything. Her financial history, her medical records if you can get them legally, any lawsuits, any debts. Find something we can use." Victoria made notes. "We'll also draft a cease and desist letter citing harassment and defamation. File for a restraining order. Make this costly for her to continue." "What about the documents she showed?" Blake asked. "The blueprints. They looked real." "Authentic old blueprints don't prove ownership," Victoria said smoothly. "She could have worked on projects without being a partner. We'll position her as a former employee, valued in her time, but now unfortunately confused about her role." Harrison nodded. "I want friendly journalists ready with stories about elder financial fraud, about scam artists targeting successful companies. I want her to look like either a con artist or a senile old woman." "Both," Derek suggested. "Hit from multiple angles. Sympathy for her condition, but firm on protecting the company's reputation." They worked through the night, building their strategy. Press releases were drafted. Lawyers prepared motions. Private investigators were hired to dig into Margaret's past and her modest apartment in Pilsen. Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by 5 decades of carefully preserved evidence, and prepared for the war she knew was coming. Sophie Reeves met Margaret again 3 days later, this time in a parking garage downtown. They sat in Sophie's car with the engine off, breath fogging the windows in the December cold. "I'm taking a huge risk showing you this," Sophie said, pulling a USB drive from her purse. "I accessed the company's digital archive. Most of the old files were scanned in the 90s. She plugged the drive into her laptop. But here's the thing, whoever did the scanning wasn't thorough. They missed metadata, marginalia, notes on the backs of documents. Look." She pulled up a scanned contract from 1969. "This is the version in the official archive. Standard partnership agreement, equal terms. But look at this PDF property, it was scanned twice. Once in 1993, then again in 2001. Why rescan a routine contract?" She pulled up another file. "Now look at this. I found it in a backup folder that was supposed to be deleted but wasn't. Same contract, different date. Someone backdated it." Margaret leaned closer, her heart racing. The evidence was more extensive than she'd dared hope. "There's more," Sophie continued. Email exchanges from 2001 between Harrison and the firm's legal team. They were doing a historical audit of the company's founding documents. "But read this." She highlighted a section, "We need to ensure all documentation reflects the standard narrative. Any references to MC as co-founder should be contextualized as consultant or employee." The old man was worried about claims if the full story emerged. "The old man," Margaret said softly. "Robert. He knew what he'd done was wrong. He spent his last years trying to bury it deeper." Sophie looked at her. "You knew he died?" "I kept track. 2004, cancer. I thought about going to the funeral, but Margaret shook her head. I wasn't ready then. Are you ready now? Margaret pulled out her own documentation, a battered accordion folder full of originals. 50 years of ready. But I need one more thing. The safe. The safe. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Breaking into the CEO's office to access a hidden safe. That's beyond risky. I know. And I won't ask you to do it. But if you can get me access to the building after hours, I'll do the rest. You can't go alone. Sophie stopped herself. I'm an old woman, Margaret finished calmly. But I'm an old woman who designed that building's security system and knows exactly where the cameras are. They planned carefully. Sophie had a company keycard that would get them through the main entrance. The executive floor required biometric scanning, but there was an old service elevator, installed during original construction, that bypassed the modern security. Margaret had designed it herself as a backup system. This is insane, Sophie muttered as they finalized the plan. If we're caught, we both go to jail. Then we don't get caught. 2 nights later, at 2:47 a.m., Margaret and Sophie entered the Silverton building through a maintenance entrance on the north side. The lock hadn't been changed since the 80s, Margaret still had the key. They moved through darkened hallways, Margaret leading despite her age. She knew every turn, every hidden passage. This building had been her creation, even if others took credit. The service elevator groaned as it rose. Sophie looked increasingly nervous, but Margaret's face was calm, almost serene. She'd waited 50 years for this moment. Harrison's office occupied the corner of the 32nd floor, with windows overlooking the Chicago River. Through the glass walls, the city sparkled in the darkness. The safe is behind the bookshelf, Margaret said, moving directly to a tall case of leather-bound books. It slides on tracks. She found the hidden release, a decorative panel that pressed inward. The bookshelf moved smoothly, revealing a wall safe with an old-fashioned combination lock. How do you know the combination? Sophie whispered. Margaret's smile was bitter. Robert's daughter's birthday. April 15, 1963. He used it for everything. Not very secure, but he was sentimental. She turned the dial with steady hands. 4-15-63. The safe opened. Inside was a fireproof box. Margaret lifted it out, set it on Harrison's desk, and opened the lid. Documents. Dozens of them. The original partnership agreement, signed and notarized, showing 50-50 ownership between Margaret Chen and Robert Silverton. Letters from Robert acknowledging Margaret's majority contribution to their early designs. Photographs of them together at groundbreakings, her name visible on permits and plaques that had long since been updated. And a letter, in Robert's handwriting, dated 3 months before his death, to whom it may concern. This is my confession. In 1971, I committed fraud against my partner Margaret Chen. Pressured by investors and my own cowardice, I used legal manipulation and societal prejudice to steal her share of Silverton development. Everything we built was possible because of her genius, her innovations, her tireless work. I took credit for her accomplishments. I told myself it was necessary, that she'd be fine, that I'd make it right someday. I never did. This is my greatest shame. If Margaret Chen is reading this, I can only say, I'm sorry. You deserved better. The world deserved to know your name. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the letter. 50 years of anger, of waiting, of carefully controlled rage, and here was the admission she'd never expected to see. Take pictures of everything, she told Sophie, her voice thick. Multiple angles. Time-stamped. Sophie worked quickly with her phone, documenting every page, every signature, every piece of evidence. They were nearly finished when the lights blazed on. Stop right there. Harrison Silverton stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 security guards. His face was a mask of fury. Breaking and entering. Theft. Corporate espionage. You've just handed me everything I need to destroy you both. But Margaret didn't move. She held up Robert's letter. Read this, Harrison. Your grandfather's confession. Written in his own hand, admitting to fraud. Admitting that I built this company with him, and he stole it from me. That's a forgery. The paper is from 2004. The ink can be dated. The handwriting can be verified. Margaret's voice was steel. And it was in your safe, which means you knew it existed. Which means you've been part of the cover-up. Harrison's jaw clenched. You think anyone will believe you broke in here legally? Everything you've just stolen is inadmissible. I'll have you both arrested. Go ahead, Margaret said calmly. Arrest a 73-year-old woman for breaking into the building she designed to retrieve evidence of fraud committed against her. I'm sure that will play wonderfully in the media. Sophie held up her phone. And I've just uploaded all of these photos to a secure cloud server. Timestamped, location tagged, and automatically shared with 3 different journalism outlets. The story goes public in. She checked her watch, 4 minutes. Harrison lunged forward, but Margaret stepped between him and Sophie. It's over, Harrison. The truth is coming out. You can try to fight it, but all you'll do is make it worse. The guards looked uncertain, glancing between Harrison and the 2 women. Get out, Harrison said finally, his voice shaking with rage. Get out of my building. Your building. Margaret said softly. This was always my building. They walked past him, past the guards, and into the elevator. As the doors closed, Margaret saw Harrison standing amid the scattered evidence, his empire crumbling around him. The story exploded. Within hours, major news outlets picked it up. Legendary architect's secret history revealed. Woman erased from architecture history reclaims her legacy. Chicago development giant built on stolen work. Margaret Chen's name, absent from architecture history for 50 years, suddenly appeared everywhere. The University of Chicago's architecture school held an emergency forum. Professors scrambled to update curricula that had attributed Margaret's innovations to Robert Silverton. Students organized protests outside the Silverton building. Old colleagues came forward with their own stories of Margaret's brilliance, of how they'd wondered why she disappeared, of hints and whispers they'd ignored or dismissed. Harrison Silverton held a press conference denying everything, claiming the documents were fabricated. But handwriting experts confirmed Robert's letter was genuine. Paper analysis dated it correctly. And most damaging, when journalists pulled the original patent filings, construction permits, and business registrations, Margaret's name was right there, visible to anyone who'd bothered to look. The architectural community rose in fury. Major firms issued statements condemning the historical erasure. Architecture magazines published special issues on women and minorities erased from the field's history. Margaret's case became a rallying point for broader conversations about credit, attribution, and systematic discrimination. Silverton Development's stock plummeted. Clients began reviewing their contracts. Employees started resigning, not wanting to be associated with a company built on fraud. Sophie Reeves lost her job, but was immediately offered positions at 3 competing firms, each wanting to show they valued integrity. She chose a boutique sustainable design firm that promised her creative freedom. Harrison Silverton was forced out by the board of directors. Criminal charges were filed for fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Blake Silverton took over as interim CEO and immediately offered Margaret a settlement. She turned it down. This isn't about money, she told the lawyers across the conference table. This is about truth. Instead, she demanded the company's name be changed to Chen Silverton Development. That all historical records be corrected to properly attribute her work. That a foundation be established to support women and minority architects. And that she be given an office and a consulting role to ensure the company finally lived up to the ideals she and Robert had shared 50 years ago. The board agreed to everything. 6 months later, Margaret Chen stood in a lecture hall at MIT, addressing 300 architecture students. The room was packed, with people sitting in the aisles and standing along the walls. She wore a simple but elegant suit, her silver hair swept back. On the screen behind her, images of her buildings rotated: the Riverside Plaza, the Morrison Medical Center, the Lakefront Cultural Complex, and dozens of others. Beneath each, a caption read, "Designed by Margaret Chen, 1968 to 1974. I want to talk to you about patience," she began. And about truth. And about why both matter. She told them her story, the partnership, the betrayal, the 50 years of waiting. She showed them the original blueprints, the patents, the evidence she'd preserved. I could have given up, she said. Many people told me to. They said it was too long ago, that no one would care, that I should just accept what had happened and move on. But injustice doesn't have an expiration date. Truth doesn't become less true because time passes. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. How did you keep going? How did you not become bitter? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I won't lie and say I wasn't angry. I was furious. For years, I dreamed of revenge, of vindication. But somewhere along the way, I realized that bitterness would only hurt me. So instead, I stayed focused on the work. I designed buildings. I mentored young architects. I found meaning in what I could do, not in what had been taken from me. She gestured to Sophie Reeves, who sat in the front row. And I stayed ready. Because I knew that someday, someone with integrity would ask the right questions. Someone would care enough to look past the official story. Justice takes time, but it comes to those who preserve the truth and wait for their allies. After the lecture, students lined up to shake her hand, to take photos, to thank her. Some were crying. One young Asian American woman could barely speak. You stayed, the woman finally said. You didn't disappear. You made sure we could see ourselves in this profession. Margaret squeezed her hand. Now you make sure the next generation can see themselves too. That evening, she returned to her apartment in Pilsen. It wasn't much bigger than before. She'd turned down offers to buy her something grander. But there were new photos on the walls now. Pictures of her receiving honorary degrees from 3 universities. Her induction into the National Academy of Design. The award ceremony where she'd been named one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, and on her desk, a new project. Silverton Development had commissioned her to design their new headquarters, a building that would honor both the past and the future, incorporating sustainable design and community spaces. At 74, Margaret Chin was finally building under her own name again. She sat at her desk, pulling out fresh drafting paper. Some architects worked entirely on computers now, but she still preferred the feel of pencil on paper for initial sketches. She began to draw, her hand steady, her mind clear. The canvas messenger bag, worn and patched, hung on a hook by the door. She'd been offered new bags, expensive ones from admirers and supporters. But she kept the old one. It had carried her truth for 50 years. It had earned its place. Outside, snow began to fall over Chicago, covering the city in white. The lights of the Riverside Plaza, her first design, glowed in the distance. The building had stood for 48 years now, a testament to her engineering brilliance. Now, finally, everyone knew whose brilliance it represented. Margaret smiled slightly and returned to her sketching, designing the future she'd always imagined, the one she'd never stopped believing in, the one she'd waited 50 years to build.